listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha, Barbour, Gatt. Whether you like them or you loathe them, cruising remains one of the most popular ways to travel and see the world. But along with those millions of cruises every year comes a lot of rubbish.
The average person on a cruise ship will be producing about 1 kilo of waste. And then you get a few things on top. One of the biggest problems they've had is food waste. And so, they are working very, very hard to reduce food waste.
In today's briefing, we're exploring the impact of cruising on the environment and whether the industry is doing enough to address it. First, though, Bension Siebert is here for the headlines. It is Monday, the 19th of August.
Good morning, Sacha. 11th hour talks are getting underway in Israel for a ceasefire deal with Hamas. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has flown into Tel Aviv as Washington pushes for a deal sooner rather than later. Negotiations have taken on a more urgent tone as tensions simmer between Israel and Iran, with hopes a ceasefire could lower the temperature in the Middle East and avoid further escalation. But while a hopeful tone was struck late last week by mediators in Qatar that a bridging proposal had been reached, both Hamas and Israel have since poured cold water on the idea that a full deal was close.
Yeah, so I think the question a lot of people would have at the moment is what exactly is holding up this ceasefire deal? We've heard talk of it since March. Remember, the last one that lasted a bit over a week was in November last year. We haven't seen any other pause to the fighting since. Essentially, Israel wants a permanent military presence on the Gaza-Egypt border and on the Netrazim corridor, which is the new Israeli-controlled barrier that bisects the Gaza Strip. Hamas, on the other hand, wants a full Israeli withdrawal, or it will not agree to ending the war. So this is one of the major sticking points that we're seeing hold up a deal at the moment. Both sides did agree to an initial proposal by the US last month, which would have included a 6-week ceasefire, a limited number of Israeli hostages being freed in exchange for Palestinians held in Israeli jails, and also an increase in humanitarian aid being able to enter Gaza. Now, that ceasefire would have been extendable as mediators thrashed out the next stage of the deal. This was going to be a 3-phase process. But since then, Hamas claims Israel has added new elements to the deal that it did not agree to, but Israel argues that those measures were necessary to stop groups like Hamas from regrouping and rearming. So that seems to be the main kind of sticking point that we're seeing at the moment between the two sides.
Yeah, and I think it is worth noting that a top negotiator for Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Iran in July. That was widely believed to be Israel that killed him. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu has criticised Hamas for not turning up to the current round of talks, but you can hardly argue that you're negotiating in good faith if you kill a negotiator on the other side. The Australian Securities and Investment Commission says it's taken down more than 7,300 websites in the first year of its operation, targeting investment and cryptocurrency scams. The program started in July 2023, targeting scams spread on social media using false celebrity endorsements. The scheme works with London-based internet services company Netcraft that can take down sites within hours of them being referred to ASIC. Netcraft uses technology to keep track of fake investment sites or recurring websites made by the same scammer. The ASIC Deputy Chair Sarah Court said that on average they're taking down around 20 sites a day. This is really good PR for ASIC, Sacha, because it is one of the agencies that's often criticised for being a bit of a slack cop on the beat.
Australian television's Night of Nights happened last night. Of course, we're talking about the Logies. Taking out the coveted gong for most popular person on Aussie TV was Larry Emder, who joked about being the most axed man in television. Netflix series Boy Swallows Universe cleaned up with 5 awards, including Best Miniseries, while its young star Felix Cameron won the hearts of the crowd when he was named Most Popular New Talent.
I'd like to thank my friends, family, my brother and my sister, and my mum and dad.
Bless him. blubbed his way through his whole speech in a very endearing way. That audio was thanks to Seven. He also took out Best Lead Actor in a Drama. He is 15 years old. Incredible young talent there. We also saw Rebecca Gibney inducted into the Hall of Fame, becoming only the fourth woman since its inception in 1984 to receive the honour. Tut, time to do better there. And making an unexpected and pretty unexplained appearance was Ray Gunn, Rachel Gunn, the Aussie breakdancer. She sent a video message of support and suggested winners break out some of her dance moves to celebrate. I'm guessing this was an organiser's call where they're like, hey, Ray Gunn, it'll be really funny. But it felt like with the Logies, right, they always get made fun of for, being a shitty version of the Emmys. And it feels like they're like a week late to the party. Do you know what I mean? Like if they had Ray Gunn on a week and a half ago, it would have been like, oh yeah, that was pretty good. But no one cares anymore. Everyone's over the Ray Gunn saga.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that everyone is over the Ray Gunn saga in the sense that she has become an Australian icon. I was at a gig last night and someone did do part of Ray Gunn's breakdancing Olympic performance on the dance floor. So it's definitely in the zeitgeist and I think it's very funny. And a man has been taken to hospital after being slapped in the face by a whale tail while fishing off the New South Wales north coast. He was out with a friend in a tinny off Tweed Heads yesterday when a whale tail popped up out of nowhere and hit him in the head, which is obviously something that happens all the time. His mate called 000 and he was taken to hospital in a stable condition. And while he didn't cop any serious injuries, he says he can't remember the incident. It's currently peak whale season along the east coast as the animals head north to mate and give birth.
Can you imagine? You see those videos sometimes of, people out paddleboarding, not in Australia, but in other places where orcas are and, they come up under their vessels or their paddleboard and it's just like the most freaky thing. I love whales. I love whale watching. I love being on a nice big safe boat though that, they might hit, but it's pretty rare. But like in a tinny and a tail just comes out of the water and slaps you in the head. I can't imagine anything more bizarre. The poor guy can't even remember. It's probably the most exciting thing that's ever happened to him. And he's like, gee, I can't remember that one. Glad he's okay though, because that could have been very, very nasty. Bension, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, it's our deep dive. Sticking on the water, we're going to look into cruising, not only how much waste it produces and the emissions it puts out, but we're going to look at what the cruising industry is doing to address that. Cruising has long been a popular form of tourism. Fears that the industry would be killed off by COVID never eventuated. Last year, more than 30 million people set sail, exceeding pre-pandemic levels. As more of us opt for a cruising holiday, the ships themselves have had to grow to meet that demand. In just 20 years, we've seen the average cruise ship size double, and by 2050, it's believed they'll be 8 times bigger than the Titanic. It's great for the industry, but concerns are growing about the potentially devastating impacts this will have on the environment, as some activists warn the emissions from cruises are getting out of control. So, what regulations do cruise companies have to follow when it comes to protecting the environment? Are they actively working to lower their emissions? And how might that change what cruises look like in the future? To explain, I'm joined now by Quentin Long from Australian Traveller. Quentin, welcome back to the briefing. Talk us through how much we've seen cruise ships change over the last few decades.
The differences between old cruise ships and new cruise ships is such a generational change in technology fundamentally, but that's also there's been a big drive to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you're starting to see some pretty large cruise ships that are the size of a small city. So, for example, I was lucky to be on the first voyage of Icon of the Seas, which is the world's largest cruise ship at the moment. So it takes about 7,500 people when it's jammed as passengers and then another 2,500 as crew. So you're looking at a pretty big group of people on a big vessel. And so with that comes all sorts of different challenges. But, from an engineering point of view, they are miraculous in the way they do what they do. Biggest challenge that they've got at the moment, Sacha, or the thing that they really are driving very hard at is the environmental credentials and what they're doing about their impact on the planet, which is absolutely a response to the current needs of the planet, but also, the way passengers are thinking and how that's changed as well.
Yeah, so on that, do we know how much waste these ships are producing? I can imagine, even a smaller ship which carries 1,000 or a couple of thousand people, the waste must be astronomical.
So what happens with cruise ships is that people start to apply a whole different set of rules than they do at land. And so that's the first thing, is try to keep that normality and comparisons right? But the average person on a cruise ship will be producing about 1 kilo of waste. And then you get a few things on top. One of the biggest problems they've had is food waste. And so, they are working very, very hard to reduce food waste. And so the simple things like, the buffet on a cruise ship gets such a bad rap, right? Everyone just thinks of all these people in stretchy pants stuffing their faces. And so they've actually done most cruise ships now don't have a free-for-all buffet. They actually have service buffets. And they're saying that this is reducing food waste by, 30%. And that's not just good for the environment, that's good for their balance sheets, that drives up profitability. So that's a win-win for everybody. The other thing that people often cite and look at, which is the actual toxins they're putting out into the environment through the engines and the engine oil. Now, look, the cruise industry is responsible for 2% of the amount of shipping fuel that's burnt. So that's a really first part. The second part is they do put scrubbers and they do remove all the toxins. The other part of that was that there used to be a big problem that they'd go to port and to generate electricity, they'd have to burn their engines to generate the electricity while in port, and that was putting a lot of fumes into the air in the middle of the port, which was a real problem. But they've now got a thing called shore power, and they're trying really hard to make sure that they don't have to burn their engines whilst in port. And that helps in that sort of making sure that things are okay as well. The final question here is, what do they do with waste on board? The modern ships these days proudly, and I'll give you an example, I was on board Sun Princess, which is the latest in the Princess Cruise Line's ships. They proudly declare that not a single piece of waste ends up in landfill off that ship, and that the waste that they do put into the water, which is the grey water, has been treated so well that it actually has no oxygen in it. It won't end up as fish food. And so this is where you're starting to see the technology change.
I'm curious to know if there are regulations that are forcing the cruising industry to make these changes, or is it down to individual companies choosing to be greener?
Yeah, it's like anything. It's a bit of both. I'm concentrating on waste because that's the big part of what everyone's worried about. Fundamentally, you've got to treat it, right? And as long as the technology is treating it to a standard, that means that it's not affecting the environment that it goes into, so the ocean, then you're okay. The other thing is that they don't want to put out warm water. They don't want to contribute to increasing the temperatures in seas and all that sort of stuff. So these things are being considered. There's also the cruise lines themselves who are really working very hard. So, for example, CLIA, which is the Cruise Line Industry Association, it's a global association. In Australia, we have an Australian version of this. So CLIA has a massive goal of reducing carbon emissions by 2030 by 40% of what they were in 2000, I think it is. And so the short rule is they're working hard at it. They're doing as much as they can, but also don't hold them to a different standard than we do on land.
I'm curious to know if international waters have any impact on how cruise ships are treating their waste or the things they need to get rid of. And I know it probably wouldn't make sense to be like, oh yeah, we're in the waters of Australia, so we'll abide by the laws, but we're going to go a little bit outside so we can dump our rubbish. Does anything like that happen? Does international waters have any, say on how cruise ships are following these environmental regulations?
Yeah, so international waters do have different standards to every country has different standards for its waters, and then once you get international, there's a sort of blanket rule based on where you are incorporated and where you are liable to. So, for example, if the ship is flagged for the Bahamas, then there'll be standards that you have to adhere to for the Bahamas and things like that. A good case study here is New Zealand. New Zealand's becoming very, very almost anti-cruise. The cruise industry is feeling like New Zealand's not that interested in having cruise ships because of the way that they are treating them and dealing with their environmental concerns. So, they've sent back a few cruise ships. They're saying your hulls are too dirty, you need to scrub them and things like that. So different jurisdictions do treat these differently. And the cruise lines work very, very hard to adhere to them because it's in their interest to do so.
How do passengers feel about cruising companies and their, adherence to green policies? Are we seeing them vote with their feet when it comes to choosing who they're cruising with?
There's a really interesting thing, Sacha. This is not just cruise. I did a whole presentation actually on this recently, which is the say-do gap. And the say-do gap is I say I'd like to, and I actually do this. And so about 60% of travellers in any vertical, in any type, say they would choose a more sustainable environmental choice. About 10 to 20% actually do. And so this is not just the cruises, but it's also an industry-wide thing. What's really driving this is really the cruise lines themselves, and governments have to put into place the right protections, and that's what will get us to where we need to go.
Before we let you go, do you think cruises and the cruising industry is maybe a little unfairly targeted because there might be, maybe a perception of who is using these ships, what sort of traveller they are, maybe mass consumption, little care about the impact they have on where they're travelling to? Do you think that's why there's more attention on the cruising industry when it comes to things like emissions and waste?
Look, let's be honest, the cruise industry hasn't been the best itself at doing that in the past. It has had some instances where it needed to clean up its act, and it has done that. In the 1990s, there was some environmental challenges in Alaska, for example, for one particular cruise line that was fined several times for discharging waste in Alaskan waters. And so, I think that the arc towards positive has been there. And, people look at cruise ships and go, I can think of nothing worse, right? Floating Petri dish is the crass. Yeah, see, Sacha, you're one of those. I get it.
I'm guilty.
Yeah, and the funny question is, how many cruise ships have you been on to come to that conclusion? And usually most of them say, I haven't been on one.
Yeah, zero.
And so there is this really weird thing where people get targeted because they see them and have that visceral reaction. So I totally agree with you that they get really weird reactions and people hold them to a different account than they do other things. So, for example, I'll give you another one. The Novovirus, which is a classic when people get sick on cruise ships and everyone runs around with their hair on fire. That happens more in the general community than it does on a cruise ship. It's just because it happened on a cruise ship. Everyone goes, how disgusting, And so we do target cruise lines and cruise ships a bit differently. And look, I've got this great thing, Sacha, which I do a lot on radio where I go, I can find the cruise for anyone. And, and the callers call up. And I love it because it really actually makes people think about what are their biases here and why. And look, I'm not going to say everyone's going to love a cruise. It's like I know people that hate hotels. Okay, that's cool. But I love different hotels. I don't love all hotels. I love this kind of hotel for this reason. I love that kind of hotel for that reason, depending on what I'm doing, And I can tell you now, taking my kids on a cruise through the South Pacific was the ultimate for my family at that point in time. I'm about to do a cruise from Athens to Istanbul with my wife, without the kids, on a beautiful, 600 people, high service, high touch, very luxurious, brand new cruise line called Explorer. Hell's yeah. And I'm going to have access to beautiful islands and a guide that's going to take me. Hell's yeah. I'm down for that. And then, the classic one I'll say to someone like you, Sacha, who's like, I can think of nothing worse. He's like, you don't want to go to the Galapagos. You don't want to go to the Galapagos then. I think you might want to.
Yeah, I feel like Antarctica is the one that maybe is opening people's eyes up to cruises as well, is because it's the only way you can get there. Yeah. So people are doing it and they're going, okay, yeah, like smaller ship and, maybe not as full of kids. That might be a turn off to some people as well.
What are you saying? My kids cause you troubles? Really? Yeah, look, Antarctica's the classic example. And look, that does have challenges because the sheer number of people going there. But if you continue to have conversations like this that puts the pressure on the cruise ships and the cruise liners, I think that will get us to where we need to get to.
That was Quentin Long from Australian Traveller speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. You can also check us out on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.